Ladies and gentlemen, praise silence for your chairman.
Ladies and gentlemen, just one or two preliminary points. The first one is this. In spite of this formidable array of mechanisms in front of me, I'm told that there is no arrangement for broadcasting sound to this room. This formidable arrangement is for the purpose of the newsreel only, and I want to know, therefore, whether you can hear me. And when I don't turn round at all like this, can you still hear me? Good, all right, thank you very much. Now, the second thing is to apologize to all those people. I'm afraid I have to say this, so it sounds frightfully. I apologize to them. Now for the chairman. You know, it's customary, I've known it happen over and over again, for chairman to get up and say that they don't want to stand between the speakers and the audience. They've no wish to do that. And then to proceed to thwart and frustrate and generally trample upon their wishes to the tune of 10 minutes by standing vigorously and resolutely between the audience and themselves. Now, taking full advantage of the 10 minutes means, among other things, saying nothing whatever about Mr. Priestly and Mr. Swaffer. You know, another thing the chairmen always do, is to get up and say that there is no need to introduce such well-known speakers to this audience, you know, and then go on introducing them hard to the tune of 10 minutes as if a tremendous need existed and as if nobody had ever heard of them. Well, and you know, I do that all the more readily because here I'm sorry to have to tell you that one of our speakers, Miss Lockhart, who we were all relying upon to explain to us what basic English is, and what it's for, and what it does, and why we should support it. One of our speakers, Miss Lockhart, is simply not here. Of course, we're here to discuss it, and so I'd better tell you what my conception of it is. I think that it is proposed to us as a medium, a device for understanding and communication between people who speak different languages. And you know, it seems to be taken for granted by everybody that increase of communication would lead to increase of understanding, increase of kindliness, increase of friendship, and therefore be a force promoting for peace. So far as I can see, history affords absolutely no warrant for that assumption. The most frequently communicating nations in history have been neighboring nations, and neighboring nations have also been the most continuously quarrelsome nations. Look at the history of France and England through the centuries. Look at the history of France and Germany through the centuries. Continuously communicating and continuously quarreling nations. And if nations aren't good enough for you as an example, take individuals. Now, the most frequently communicating pairs of individuals are the married. And most marriages seem to me to be nothing more or less than a series of misunderstandings. From what do the misunderstandings arise? Because of the continual communications between wives and their husbands and vice versa. And I would ask you from that point of view to consider by contrast, the almost legendary happiness of those men who have married dumb wives, dumb and therefore presumably non-communicating wives, how peaceful and tranquil and happy their marriages have been. I don't know of any records of wives marrying dumb and therefore presumably non-communicating husbands. But if there are any such, I am sure that they have been very happy women. Indeed, and if we have to make a common world with them, quite obviously established after the war all over Europe youth hostels, international youth hostels, to which the young people to whose business it will fall to make the world after the war, not to you and me, we're too old and too dyed in the wool of nationalism and prejudice to be able to do any such thing, but to the young people. It would be possible to them to go, spend a time in those youth hostels, possible, perhaps obligatory upon every European state to establish scholarships to enable them to do so. And I see an army of young people after the war, from every country, traveling to and fro up and down Europe, spending nights in these international youth hostels, and between them, by virtue of their communications, their understanding, and let us hope their friendliness, joining together to lay the common foundations of the world after the war. That I always think of is one of the reasons why we went to all that trouble to acquire an empire. It was less trouble to us to acquire an empire and to rule large parts of the world than to learn other people's languages. In fact, one of the very great advantages of having an empire is that it emancipates you from the necessity of learning other people's languages and puts upon them the obligation to learn yours. Granted then an international language, basic English it must be, and here, ladies and gentlemen, we come actually to the theme of this lunch, basic English, a theme which, having introduced it, I feel under no necessity myself to canvass or to continue any further. And at this point, I'm going to call upon the first of my two speakers, Mr. Priestly, to do it for me. Well, now, you know, I said at the beginning that I didn't propose to introduce my speakers. And I don't propose to do so. And yet I feel I must say something about Mr. Priestly, and I don't quite know what to say. Well, now, I resent that very much, you see, because being a philosopher myself, I've got certain claims upon time in my own right. And here's Mr. Priestly with all his literary aliases at his command. Mr. Priestly in the shape of the Conways, Mr. Priestly in the shape of Mr. Jordan, Mr. Priestly with all his terrific prestige, and with all his literary garlands fresh about his brow. Well, really, he's a very formidable rival to a modest, drab philosopher like myself. So CU of Joad and 3 cheers for Mr. Priestly, and put them all together. Mr. Priestly.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's typical of a philosopher, and it's probably the reason why some of us are losing our interest in philosophy, that our chairman, throughout that little episode of washing the clean linen of myself and Time and Mr. Dunn in public, would refer to a Mr. Jordan when he meant a Mr. Johnson. My Mr. Johnson went over Jordan, but to the average philosopher there's no difference between the man going over the river and the river flowing under the man. Now, it's true that I don't know very much about time, although I do know, you will be glad to hear, I do know when it's time to sit down. But I know even less about basic English, and I've been wondering throughout lunch why I'm here. And I've come to the conclusion, the only reason is this, that as a Yorkshireman, I'm fairly representative of one of those small primitive native tribes who are acquiring a smattering of English and may be assumed to benefit a good deal from adopting basic English. But I'm not going to do one thing that nearly everybody does when on this subject. Nearly every time I've read an article, I think every time so far I've read an article or heard a talk on basic English, I've noticed that the style was a little strained and rather peculiar, but assumed that the writer or the speaker had a headache or something. And then suddenly in the middle there's the coy announcement but this article that you are reading or that this talk you are listening to is actually in basic English. Now, you'll be delighted to know that this talk of mine is not in basic English.